My name is Gabe Newell, and welcome to Half-Life Alyx. To say this product was a challenge would be an understatement. It's our first Half-Life title in over 10 years, and it's our first one in virtual reality. In addition to it being a great VR experience that still felt like a Half-Life game, we wanted Half-Life Alyx to serve players who've been waiting to find out what happens after Episode 2, and at the same time, provide an on-ramp to anyone who hasn't played a Half-Life game at all. Ultimately, whether we succeeded in any of that is up to you to decide. But hopefully, this commentary mode will give you some insight into the set of problems we faced and how we chose to tackle them. To listen to a commentary node, pick up the floating hologram of a radio headset in front of you and simply put it on your head. Once you're done listening to the commentary, you can take the radio headset off or simply put on the next one. Please let me know what you think. I can be reached at gaben@valvesoftware.com. While I'm unable to reply to all the emails I receive, I do read them all, and they're a critical part of the feedback we use to evaluate our work. Thanks, and have fun.
As in the case of any Half-Life game, the first hour of Alyx must convey a lot of information to the player, hopefully in a natural and entertaining way. Players need to know who they are, where they are, what kind of world they're in, who the other important characters and factions are, and so on. At the same time, they need to learn how to actually play the game. How do they move? What can they interact with and how? What should they be trying to do, etc. Figuring out exactly what information we would try to convey in these first two levels, and how it would be conveyed, took us over 2 years of playtesting. It's tempting to try and include everything we think a player should know, but all information has a priority, and the more we include, the more chance there is that a player misses something important because they're distracted or confused by something less important. So over the next 2 levels, we'll use commentary nodes to point out some of the specific places where we grappled with conveying information to the player. In between these nodes, you'll likely be able to spot many other examples for players to find, if they're interested in paying closer attention and understanding more.
One of the pieces of important information we struggled to convey was exactly when Half-Life Alyx is set within the series timeline. Whilst we tried to reflect it carefully in many of the world details, it was never 100% successful during playtests. Eventually, we decided it was too important to be left to the players to figure out, and so we put it in our opening text crawl. The Citadel's incomplete state did provide us with an early opportunity to reinforce the timeline visually. Half-Life Alyx takes place 5 years before the events of Half-Life 2, in which the towering Citadel represents the Combine seat of power. As we see here, however, early Combine infrastructure is a cluttered mess of cables and unusual structures sprawled all over the city, surrounding the Citadel's construction, and served as a useful indicator of the time frame. We went on to reinforce this impression in other places throughout the following level. Combine architecture tends to be abstract in scale and form, so we included some familiar visual cliches of human construction: the large external scaffolds, some distinction of floor levels, rows of small lights, and the tidying of the silhouette into more structured vertical elements. Try and strike a balance between capturing the alien nature of the Citadel whilst grounding its construction in enough familiarity to better understand its size and state. Large, sweeping vistas such as this one proved an interesting challenge in virtual reality. Their distance from the viewer means they don't benefit from stereoscopic vision the way that small close-up objects do. Because of this, the small objects on the balcony often draw the attention of the players before they've even noticed the imposing structure in the distance. If we moved the Citadel too close, it felt absurdly huge and difficult to take in. Yet placed alone on the horizon, it felt two-dimensional and flat. We found the solution in filling the space between the viewer and the distant structure with many scale references. The city itself, huge supply cables leading towards the vanishing point, large repeated Combine buildings, heavy pollution fog, careful lighting, and all the animated elements, especially the helicopter whose sound begins in the fade-in. All these were carefully composed to help draw the attention of the player to the Citadel first, before letting their attention wander to take in the details of the city, and settle ultimately on the inviting items here on the balcony.
Alyx! 'Cause
How's it looking up there?
It's good, Dad.
In these first areas of the game, we grappled a lot with the density and prioritization of the information we were conveying to the player. Playtesting showed us that players in VR were easily distracted, often due to better peripheral vision, such that they'd focus on one scene element while losing track of others. This was exacerbated in these first rooms because players were acclimatizing to being in VR, often for the first time. In addition, different players progress at different speeds. We saw some players spend 30 seconds on the opening balcony and others 30 minutes. As a result, we did a lot of iteration over the set of opening areas, each time changing what information we tried to convey and where. Initially, the video call from Eli took place in the later Refuge room with the snark and camcorder, but players were often too engrossed in interacting with all of the detail in that room to pay attention to the conversation between Eli and Russell. We moved the video call out to the starting balcony, but there it distracted from the establishing shot of City 17 and the Citadel. It also came at a time when players were still figuring out core game elements like movement and hand interaction with the world. That collision made simple things hard, like when to show the player a movement tooltip if they immediately started the video call. Eventually, we settled on inserting the greenhouse between the starting balcony and the Refuge, which allowed us to move the call to an area with a slightly obscured vista and fewer interactable objects. This avoided the distraction problems and ensured players were past the initial gameplay moments of figuring out their hardware and movement setup. It also had the bonus of allowing us to add further detail to the opening balcony and Alex's Refuge without fear of creating distractions from the video call.
Conveying critical information about the state of the world, the first two levels of Half-Life Alyx also needed to demonstrate some of VR's strengths. Conveying a sense of scale is something VR does much better than flat screens, and our early playtests showed us that nothing quite sold that scale more than seeing a Strider up close. In addition to the visuals, to fully illustrate the scale of a Strider at close range, we needed to do a lot of work on its audio treatment. Players had strong expectations about feeling the weight, power and presence of the Strider through its movements, particularly as it stepped on the balcony the player was occupying. In order to convey this power through sound, we layered multiple sound effects, allowing us to address ranges in the audio frequency spectrum and the temporal nature of those elements separately. We then combined those elements in the Source 2 audio engine to control them as one sound.
This room, internally referred to as Alex's Refuge, was initially the location where the Eli video call took place. However, once that video call was moved out to the balcony, this room was freed up to solve other problems. In the Half-Life series, we've always tried to ensure that there's generally enough narrative for all players to understand where they're going and why, but for players who slow down and pay attention, there's more detail that can lead to a greater understanding. With the balcony being a place to get familiar with the game's inputs, the greenhouse being where the story kicks off, and the Strider there to surprise players with spectacle, we decided that the Refuge could be a quiet moment for players, where they could discover more narrative detail in the environment. At the same time, it could be a place where they can play around a bit more now that they're acclimated to being in VR. Spending time in the Refuge is meant to bring players into Alex's role in the Resistance and her place in the world. We wanted it to feel like a real stakeout spot, where Alex had been cooped up for weeks or months while planning the heist, doing research on the Combine. The camcorder, snark, and whiteboards are all toys that respond to detailed interaction and reward deeper investigation, giving curious players more information about the world of City 17 and what Alex has been doing in it.
Are we good?
Yep, they got
Two critical pieces of information that we needed players to understand were simple to state, but not so easy to convey. That players were playing as Alex Vance, not the Gordon Freeman they've played in all prior Half-Life games, and that Alex is going to speak, unlike Gordon. These probably seem obvious to you now, but until we focused on them, it wasn't obvious to playtesters. Ensuring that everyone realized they were playing as Alex was something we decided to hit with the biggest hammer we could, and named the product after her. But even with that, we were very careful in Eli's video call to ensure it's reinforced immediately. Olga, the character introduced here, was added to further drive it home by calling out when the player exits the elevator. Olga is the first character the player meets in person, and her dialogue here, and again ahead in the alley, is aimed at driving home the fact that she's conversing with the player, and that the disembodied female voice the player hears is Alex speaking back. This was harder to convey in Eli's video call, because it already features Russell speaking off-screen, whereas in this scene, there's clearly no one else around in the conversational space other than Olga and the player. Without Olga, we found that, even though they had already spoken to Eli and Russell over the video call, playtesters still didn't feel like they were Alex.
When we started Half-Life Alyx, we were very curious to find out how VR would impact our music design. The Half-Life series has always used music sparingly, often leaving the ambient sounds of the world to provide the audio background. But it is a tool we like to use to highlight moments where the world state has changed in some important way. In this case, that something's riled up the Combine. In our early playtests of this scene, without music, but with many of the other visual and audio elements represented, we found some players didn't understand that they should move along, and that others became distracted by the interactive objects in the laundry. We experimented with some very simple quote-unquote action music to communicate the changing of the Combine threat level, as well as the story's intention for Alex to get to safety, and found that players were less likely to forget their quest and move towards their goal. The music was kept simple and cinematic sounding to allow it to blend with the purposely complementary background sounds and gently start to normalize the use of music in VR in a familiar way. This success encouraged us to use the same technique in scenes with similar requirements later in the game.
The remainder of this level is designed to continue informing the player about the world they're in, and to support the increase in the Combine's alertness. We also wanted detail to make the city feel alive, something that becomes much harder later on, once the player has a weapon. This was tricky to design due to the challenge we're often faced with, the friction between narrative state and gameplay state. Here, the narrative implies that Alex should be making her way back to Eli as quickly and quietly as possible. But gameplay-wise, we're at the start of the game, and players are still testing the limits of everything they can see and touch. Unsurprisingly, playtesting showed us that some players would dedicate themselves to following the narrative and quickly move through the area, while others would completely ignore the narrative and explore every nook and cranny. While it's tempting to simply remove all distractions in an attempt to unify all players towards following the narrative, it would send the wrong signal about the density of our world and how the game intends to reward players for exploring. So we spent months refining this section, adding, changing, and removing elements. We tried to find the right level of narrative tension, where players felt like they should be moving along, but not so quickly that they can't stop to tinker with something. We put in enough interactive objects and narrative moments where players were always rewarded for looking around, but we designed all those distractions to end quickly, so we could encourage players to continue moving along.
Whoa, wait, I just live here!
Probably anti-citizen. Get those hands off!
Wait, don't shoot!
Stop! Get back! Give us
Dad! Hey, wait, no! Where are you taking me?
In order to limit the possibility of motion sickness that could be induced by moving the player in a vehicle, we initially wrote this scene to have Alex wake up after the van had already crashed. Players found this underwhelming, however, since the game seemed to be needlessly holding back an exciting moment that they could have experienced for themselves. Addressing this meant that we had to tackle the technical problem of moving the player comfortably in a vehicle. In this van, and in the train at the end of the map, you'll notice that the outside world is only visible through small windows. These outside views are necessary to provide motion parallax, but the small window size ensures that the player's field of view is always dominated by the vehicle interior, which is naturally in the player's own frame of reference. This greatly reduces the occurrence of motion sickness. Aside from the parallax of the outside world, we use animated lighting and careful sound design to produce the effect of riding in a vehicle.
Alex, you there? You've got to get moving.
Russell? I've been in an accident.
I know! I caused it, so technically not an accident. You've got to get moving.
Wait, where's Dad?
He's fine. Follow the drone.
So, Dad's okay, right?
Yeah, well, no. To be honest, he's in huge trouble.
But
they've still got him. He was in a separate
Where the last map was focused on conveying a lot of information about the world state to the player, this map is where we need to start the player's larger quest. That means the player must leave this map with an understanding of what's happened to Eli, and what they're going to do about it. The player also needs to meet Russell, so they have a face behind all the radio dialogue throughout the game. Finally, we need the player to collect the gravity gloves and the pistol and learn how to use them both. This is a daunting list. From experience, we know that if we cram all that into a single scene, players won't be able to remember more than a couple highlights. So this map's purpose is essentially narrative pacing. We need to draw apart the required events, separating them with enough time and space that players could ingest and remember them. At the same time, we're a little under the gun. Playtesting showed us that by now, some players have been playing for 30 minutes, and they're wondering when they're going to see some enemies.
One of the first steps the writing team took on this map was to flesh out a scene between Russell and Alex that covered all the dialogue we needed. Due to the fact the player is meeting Russell for the first time, and that there are a significant number of in-fiction events that Alex and Russell need to talk about, the scene ended up containing a lot of dialogue. We knew there was no way we could build a scene that long without boring the player, and the most important elements would be lost in the noise.
Russell.
One of the first tools we used to address this was the introduction of Russell's drone. It allowed us to take chunks of the dialogue from that original scene and deliver them throughout the area preceding the scene. This meant the scene itself could skip over the in-fiction preliminaries and get right to the critical goal delivery.
And your dad.
Russell, just hang on. I'm almost there.
In addition to delivering narrative at a consumable pace, this map needed to continue communicating the state of the world outside of the quarantine zone. We also wanted players to understand when Half-Life Alyx takes place in the larger Half-Life timeline, and to see for themselves the massive scale of the Citadel under construction. The power of the Combine is embodied in their indifference towards humanity. They've conquered Earth with little effort and are now plundering it for their own ends. They put a modicum of effort into their propaganda, but it's ultimately uncaring. Later in Half-Life 2, we see Breen's attempts to talk to humanity with more seriousness, but it's unclear whether that directive comes from the Combine or if it's just Breen's attempts to be useful to them. Meanwhile, the Combine construction is brutally efficient. The Citadel's pervasive feeder cables make no attempt to fit into the lives of the residents as the Combine drains the city of its power. Within this playground, a nostalgic nod to Half-Life 2. This enormous cable has been run right through the mural on the wall, demonstrating the Combine's total lack of interest in the history behind the city.
Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, I'll be there in a minute.
Alex, great. Okay, let's... Wait, my drone's okay, right?
Nope, it exploded. I'm fine, by the way.
Right, good, well, that's the thing.
Russell, they've got Dad.
Russell's laboratory is the first time the player is in the same room as another character, and it highlights one of the main challenges we face when designing choreographed scenes in VR, keeping the player and characters out of each other's space. In previous Half-Life games, we could always forcefully move the player if we really needed them out of the way. We made several attempts at finding a similar solution in VR, but found that it often made players feel deeply uncomfortable or disoriented. So instead, we designed these spaces to allow for a natural separation between the player and our characters. Where natural separators couldn't exist, we had to restrict players from moving into the character's space, removing that limitation as soon as the character had moved out of the way. Another challenge was balancing how often characters respond to player actions while delivering important narrative information. In early experiments, we allowed characters to stop mid-sentence, which allowed them to respond immediately to the player, and then continue on with their dialogue. While technically straightforward, this was incredibly difficult to execute in animation and dialogue without feeling unnatural. The combination of custom reactions necessary to cover the range of possible player interaction and the resulting return to narrative dialogue quickly multiplied out of control. Eventually, we settled on a solution where we allowed only a minimum of interactions during the important narrative delivery sections, and a wider range of responses to more complex reactions after the scene has completed. In the case of Russell, we layer subtle head facing and natural eye contact on top of his performance while he is talking with Alex. Then, after the scene, when he is typing at the computer, he will respond to players trying to touch him or objects being thrown around.
The gloves, Alex. You know, the gravity gloves. I have a few sets through there. You can calibrate them out by the shed.
Got it.
We can do this, Alex. You got that, didn't you, that I said we could do it? Because we're gonna do it.
Right from our earliest experiments in VR, we learned that players expect a high level of audio fidelity, even from minute interactions, particularly when the sounds are meant to correspond to clearly observable visuals. For instance, in one of our prior games, it may have been acceptable to use a generic sequence of computer key sounds when Russell was typing. In VR, however, we know that a player can observe the animations very closely, and even put their head right next to Russell's keyboard if they choose. In this case, players would notice a lack of one-to-one correspondence between the key press animation and sound. For Half-Life Alyx, we authored a set of individual key press sounds to be driven by animation. For example, as Russell's fingers animate to press a key, one of these key press sounds is played, resulting in precise synchronization of the animation and sound.
Yep, you're tethered.
One frustration players may encounter in VR is having to physically bend down or reach out for objects in the virtual world, especially if they have limited real-world space. A common solution for this is to provide a way to bring objects to the player instead of forcing the player to go to them. We knew this would be an important feature in Half-Life Alyx, with its sprawling levels and players' desire to explore every corner of the world. We didn't want this mechanic to feel too gamey or magical, so we decided to integrate it into the fiction of the game by making it a feature of the gravity gloves, which are a natural precursor to the gravity gun of Half-Life 2. This allowed us to present the mechanic as a real physical action that's enabled by a piece of in-fiction technology. To emphasize the physicality that is unique to the medium of VR, we used a physical gesture to activate the pull instead of a button press. and then required the player to actually catch the object instead of automatically attaching it to the hand. This made the mechanic feel more natural and rooted in the fiction of the game's universe, while allowing the player to feel powerful and accomplished.
Oh, almost forgot. Guns need ammo. Here you go. Right, heading back to the courtroom.
When a player pulls an object with the gravity gloves, we use the game's physics engine to apply a launch force to that object with a trajectory that is partially influenced by the direction of the player's pull gesture. We set the object's launch velocity to result in a standard flight time from pull to catch, so the player can develop a rhythm that eventually becomes automatic. We want the object to arrive at the hand as reliably as possible, so after the initial launch, we continually apply small impulse forces along the trajectory, represented by the white arrows. Those impulses help counter gravity and compensate for collisions with obstacles along the way, while continuously steering the object toward the hand, which is itself a moving target. A generous catch range and subtle haptic feedback when the object enters that range virtually guarantees that it will end up in the player's hand every time, even if their attention is focused elsewhere. One other benefit of implementing this with physics is that we didn't need to do custom handling for an object's size, mass, or inertia, and it automatically compensated for the non-standard gravity that players encounter inside the vault at the end of the game.
Oh, you took care of that lock then. Good. Great. Didn't have the key for it, but should have given you that. That's on me. All right, here we go. Next stop, Fairview Junction.
Thanks, Russell.
And good luck, Alex. Goodbye. Obviously, just to let you know, I am still here, though.
I know.
Hello, Alex? We might have a problem. Probably nothing to worry about, but... Did the train stop? It stopped, didn't it?
Yeah, what happened?
It's jammed. When the Combine shut down the quarantine zone, they must have tightened security.
Which means?
Yeah, you're nowhere near Fairview Junction. You're just outside the QZ. And this is as far as we get by train.
Then I'm headed on foot.
Good. I'll see if I can get you in some other way.
I got a dead zombie here. I thought the Combine sealed up the QZ.
This one must have squirted out. I've heard they've had trouble with barnacle spores outside the containment area, but not about fellas like this.
Even in our earliest experiments in bringing Half-Life to VR, we found that players enjoyed exploring every nook and cranny of the environment. With the increased fidelity of VR, players not only expected to be able to interact with a vast array of objects, but they also had a strong desire to find something useful from time to time. This was so universal among testers that in addition to more searchable locations and interactive objects, we added a new resource, resin. Level designers could place this new resource in fun and interesting locations that weren't tied to game progression, rewarding players wider-ranging exploration. We also tied this new resource to a longer-term goal in the form of weapon upgrades, further motivating players to explore the environment. Deep scavenger hunts and keen observation would result in more resin to spend as a reward.
Internally, we refer to this type of puzzle as a toner puzzle, due to its similarity to a real-world cable toner tool that can be used to locate electrical wires in walls. The toner mechanic was conceived as a tool for designers to craft player experiences around knowing that the player had to put their head and hands in specific locations. The initial design merely required the player to use their multi-tool to push a ball of energy along a path, similar to a child's bead maze toy. While this simple design was successful at getting the player to put their head and hands in particular locations, the lack of branching meant that the player wasn't required to make any choices, nor was there any possibility of negative consequences. To address these issues, we added the rotating junction elements, which allowed for branching paths and became the player's primary means of interacting with toner puzzles. While the toner puzzles ramp up in complexity throughout the game, this first toner puzzle is designed to use a minimal number of elements to introduce players to the key ideas that power flows through wires, power can be rerouted by rotating junctions, and power has an effect on the physical world, such as turning on lights and opening gates. The sparking electrical outlet that branches down toward the floor is not strictly necessary for this simple puzzle, but it was added here to expose players to its behavior, since it was causing confusion in later puzzles when players were seeing it for the first time in more complex configurations.
From our earliest experiments in VR, we realized how critical high-quality, high-density lighting was to conveying a sense of realism. In game development, any technology choice involves trade-offs between quality, runtime performance, and development time. For Half-Life Alyx, we chose a high-quality, high-performance light mapping solution which required a significant amount of offline preprocessing. We performed the light map preprocessing using a render farm, which could take several hours for a single map at the highest quality, and we put a lot of effort into mitigating the cost of that high iteration time for designers on the team. Specifically, we implemented a real-time approximation to the final lighting result, which allowed designers to light scenes in real time with confidence that the high-performance light maps would match their intent. Most lights in Half-Life Alyx are baked into a single term that describes distance falloff and shadowing, allowing us to change the brightness and color of lights in real time at no cost. This encoding also allows us to apply shadows from dynamic props and characters without having to render any static geometry into shadow maps. Our light maps store directional information using the popular ambient highlight direction encoding, an improvement over Valve's own radiosity normal mapping technique pioneered in Half-Life 2. This new light map encoding ensures that the bumpy surfaces can appear bumpy even when not under direct light. This blinking light source provides a good illustration of this technique, as you can perceive the surface detail even during times the light source is off.
Barnacles, while an iconic Half-Life creature, presented some interesting VR-specific challenges. While their tongue is intended to trap hasty or unobservant players, those caught by them often didn't realize what was happening. They would become disoriented or even motion sick as the barnacle lifted them up to be eaten. These unfortunate players almost universally died, and failed to learn what was happening even after multiple encounters. To address this issue, we created the tongue as a particle system. This allowed us to both physically simulate it as well as reliably position it for maximum visibility. If a player does get grabbed by a barnacle, the tongue always wraps right in front of their face, no matter which direction they try to look. This makes the tongue almost impossible to miss and visually guides the player's eyes up to the location of the barnacle, so they know where to shoot to free themselves. These fixation visuals that kick in as the player is being lifted not only serve to communicate the damage the player is taking, but they also help to reduce motion sickness by narrowing the player's field of view. These changes, combined with sound effects and other visuals like seeing stars and blacking out, eliminate confusion for players and enabled us to bring this classic enemy into the world of Half-Life Alyx.
Oh, they're gross. How'd you meet my dad, anyway? You guys work together at Black Mesa, right?
Yeah. Well, no. Tricky place to get a job at, actually. I interviewed at Black Mesa. They said try again in a year. I don't need to tell you what happened after that.
We got a lot of positive feedback from our initial experiments requiring players to perform a series of physical actions to reload the pistol. Specifically, ejecting the clip, retrieving a new clip from their backpack, inserting the clip into the gun, and chambering around. Players enjoyed learning and improving at this skill. We experimented with using a single button for both ejecting a clip and chambering around, but we found that assigning these operations to two different buttons was more interesting, even though it was more mentally taxing. In fact, it was more interesting precisely because it was more mentally taxing, as players would frequently mix up the buttons under pressure. In the early stages of the game, players would be fumbling for clips, ejecting the clips when they meant to be chambering around, and generally making a mess. To those of us observing the playtest, this looked like things had gone horribly wrong, but players themselves consistently cited this as a high point of their playthroughs. Because of the physical nature of the reload, and the skill required, players blamed themselves and not the game for the mistakes made as they were learning the reloading sequence. In this area, we provide a number of static targets in the form of barnacles for players to shoot at their own pace, increasing the likelihood that they have at least a few reloads under their belt before moving on.
I take it the quarantine zone is behind this hatch?
Yeah, that's where they keep it.
I'll look around for a control panel to open it up.
Ugh.
In prior Half-Life games, while playing as Gordon, the player saw Alyx use her multi-tool to hack into Combine security systems in order to unlock doors or perform other acts of sabotage. This presented an opportunity for us to represent Alyx's hacking skills through VR-centric minigames. All of our hacking minigame designs were built to leverage the independently tracked head and hands common to today's VR systems. We wanted to encourage players to use both hands simultaneously and move their head to create parallax to understand the spatial relationships within the puzzles. This locker hacking puzzle is based upon one of our earliest prototypes, in which the player was tasked with using a tool in one hand to paint a path on a sphere held by the other hand. There was just something fun and unique about using all of the natural degrees of freedom of both hands to solve a puzzle in VR. In its simplest form, this puzzle solution is straightforward, but the difficulty gradually increases throughout the course of the game by introducing static or moving obstacles of various shapes and sizes on the sphere.
Well, actually, the word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni, which means 40 days, the period that all ships were required to be isolated before crew could go ashore during the Black Death.
Alright. Cool.
That's the control panel. They've probably scrambled the circuit. Considering no one would be dumb enough to open the hatch, it shouldn't be too hard to put back.
Fairview Junction?
You'll go through the old subway tunnels on your way to the train yard.
Whoa. Russell, are you seeing this?
Whoa.
All right. Here we go.
In our early prototypes, players could heal themselves by grabbing a Half-Life 2 health pack and pressing down on a controller button, which obviously wasn't a very interesting VR interaction. During the development of Half-Life Alyx, the Counter-Strike team added health injectors into CSGO as part of the new Danger Zone game mode they were developing. When we saw this, we felt that an injector would work well as an intuitive healing item in VR as well. Players would press a button to arm the injector as a way of indicating their intent to use it. This prevented unintentional use of the injector and gave us an opportunity to showcase how physical the interaction was going to be via haptics, animation, and sound. Some testers even initially responded with dread over the fact they were going to have to use a needle on themselves and looked away when performing the injection action. We also had to create approximations of the player's arms and body, as playtesters all had their own preferences for where they wanted to apply the injection. We even added the ability to inject into the head since so many players tried to do it just to see if it would work.
Do you hear that?
What is that? Oh boy.
We had to ensure that players would become proficient at reloading their pistol during the early levels of the game, or later encounters in the game would be overly difficult. The prior map contained only static targets in the form of barnacles. Players could engage the barnacles at their own pace, but there were enough of them that players would need to reload at least a few times. This first live zombie is locked behind the chain link fence and cannot reach the player until the player opts into the encounter by shooting the lock on the door. The placement of zombies in the upcoming section of the game is designed to require plenty of reloading, to ensure that the player builds up this skill.
Alright, that seems to work. Let's keep doing that. Oh, just so you know, the Russells have a built-in display that shows your resin, ammo, might come in handy.
Got it. Thanks.
Virtual reality provides the opportunity to add physicality to gameplay, but this needs to be balanced against player fatigue and accessibility. For example, we experimented with a low ceiling in this area, requiring players to crouch the whole time that they made their way across the tops of these train cars. Playtesters did not enjoy having to crouch for so long, so we raised the ceiling.
Oh boy.
Yeah, be careful.
Virtual reality provides the opportunity to add physicality to gameplay, but this needs to be balanced against player fatigue and accessibility. For example, we experimented with a low ceiling in this area, requiring players to crouch the
breakable glass panels in Half-Life Alyx are yet one more system designed to convince players that they are present in a living, breathing world. The panels detect the position of an incoming impact and procedurally generate new, smaller glass panels in a radial pattern around the impact position. These new panels can then break into smaller panels themselves, and so on. We found that players would often break glass panels accidentally, then spend time testing just how interactive they really were by trying to break them more, eventually realizing that yes, the glass really did shatter at the appropriate location. At one point, we experimented with building special puzzles out of breakable glass, but in the end we found the glass to be more appropriate as a passive interactive element in the world, one that reacts in a satisfying way to a variety of impacts, from zombie melee attacks to incoming gunfire or any other physical interaction in the game.
Alex, I think there's a combine fabricator. Put something in
Weapon
it.
upgrades are a new feature for the Half-Life franchise, and fictionally this mechanic paired well with Alex's tinkering nature. We approached this design challenge first by thinking about what sort of upgrades could be meaningful and also provide additional value to players without removing established interactions. With limited resin to spend, the upgrade system also provided an avenue for players to personalize and invest in their favorite weapon, or streamline an interaction on another weapon, increasing its value to them. For example, the reflex sight still requires players to physically aim, but it improves the feedback on exactly where their shot will hit, and exposes previously hidden enemy weak points. While some players enjoyed this feedback and new targeting opportunities, others didn't and would instead focus on upgrades that suited their style of play. This allowed players to spend their limited resin on upgrades they cared about the most. Another aspect of weapon upgrades that we focused on was not necessarily obvious when we first started to design and test combat in VR. Due to the more physical nature of combat in VR, it can really push on the mental and physical capacity of certain players, as they're required to utilize both their hands and move their head to take in the environment dealing with enemies. While this is a very natural experience, there's also a lot going on at any given point with reloading and combat. As we observed players in some of these more intense combat situations, we started finding opportunities to allow some upgrades to reduce the number of times a physical interaction was required, or reduce the complexity of a particular interaction. The autoloader on the shotgun is a good example. When added to the shotgun, the normally slow, methodical action of feeding shells into the gun is replaced with a far simpler, faster interaction of slapping the shells into the autoloader before they get automatically fed into the gun. This allows players to look around, focus less on the gun while reloading, and take in more of what's going on around them.
You know what they say about resin, Alex?
No, what do they say about resin, Russ?
Look for more resin.
Okay. I'll keep an eye out.
Yeah, that's the one. Look for more resin.
At the beginning of the Half-Life Alyx project,
We had the expectation that players would want to take a break after 30 to 45 minutes, since that's what we were seeing with the lab and other small-scale VR experiences available at the time. Because of this, we designed the pacing of the game's levels around play sessions of that duration. Over the course of development, however, the game itself included more downtime between intense combat encounters, and the comfort of the new crop of HMDs improved significantly. In fact, as the game progressed, we found that players were happy to play for hours on end. At the end of a playtest, players would often remark that this was the longest they had ever played VR in a single session.
Alex. Thanks. You know, for all your talk about what a lesser gun this thing isn't half bad.
Head crab!
I see it.
Until this point in the game, players have only seen headcrabs attached to the heads of zombies. This led playtesters familiar with headcrabs from prior games to anticipate encountering them on their own. We decided to play up this anticipation by foreshadowing the first headcrab encounter with a headcrab that drops out of a vent before disappearing, as well as headcrab sounds in the environment, including a threatening headcrab sound coming from the partially boarded up doorway ahead.
Where to go? Ah! Yep, there it is. Found it. Probably only one of those. Okay, two of those.
Heard anything about Dad, Russell?
No. Radio silence since he got on the train.
Damn it.
Well, the good news is he's probably fine.
How do you know that?
Because they're taking him to Nova Prospect to torture him. That's the torture place. So they're hardly going to torture him before they get there. So he's fine. Logically speaking.
Russell, are you seeing this?
Possibly. Are you seeing floating garbage?
It looks like it's just cardboard.
Right. Well, seems harmless.
What is that?
There are two layers to the markings on the walls in this area. The square and dot patterns, that are the functional elements of the environmental puzzle, and the mural representing the Vortigaunt's interpretation of the events of the Half-Life saga. For the first few years of development, This area only contained the dot pattern supporting the perspective puzzle, but as we fleshed out the rest of the level, we found that playtesters responded especially positively to the Vortigaunt's wall markings leading up to the hideout. It was at this point that we realized that this area could serve as a canvas for our Vortigaunt's artistic magnum opus. To do this, we organized the dot patterns into a sort of swirling starfield behind the Vortigaunt's art. The imagery itself, which was inspired by petroglyphs and other traditional rock art, portrays many significant events from the Combine invasion, painted hurriedly by the injured Vortigaunt, almost as if he was trying to capture what fleeting memories he still had of the vortessence from which he had been severed. The fact that Vortigaunts have a complicated relationship with time gave us a lot of leeway in terms of drawing this as a strict, linear timeline. For example, you may notice that the Vortigaunt uses contemporary Combine troops as shorthand for Combine invasions from the past, or that the timeline is just generally hazy. A little from the past, little from the present, and a little looking forward to the future events of Half-Life 2.
There are many musical themes and motifs used throughout the game to represent unspoken aspects of the story and lore. For example, the Vortigaunts play an integral role in the subplot of the game, and we chose to use music to subconsciously communicate the repeating nature of their role both in the timeline of Half-Life Alyx and in the larger timeline of the Half-Life saga. Within the music in this scene, you'll hear variations of themes used throughout the timeline of the game, from the very first sounds of the game up to the finale in the vault. Variations of these motifs represent the imprisoned chanting of the Vortigaunts, the extraction of their energy to confine the G-Man, as well as historically familiar sounds representing the vortessence itself.
Alex, you alright? What's wrong?
I'm fine, Russell. What's up?
I'm losing your signal. Alex? Alex? If you can still hear me, keep heading in the same direction and try to get above ground.
Russell? Russell? Crap. Whoa. This is weird.
During our earliest attempts to raid Alex, our instinct was to have her react to absolutely everything. But what we learned from playtesting was that Alex reacting too much could actually be off-putting. Say a player's in a really tense, zombie-filled level, and they're having a great time, but suddenly Alex is in their head, sounding angry, or frightened, or anxious. These Alex reactions were creating a disconnect between how the player was feeling and how the character they were role-playing as was feeling. So we took a lot of those out. The Alex reactions we left in tended to be the ones that were practically universal. Alex's reaction here to the surreal entrance to the Vort hideout is a good example, where it was just so different from everything the player had seen up until then, and kind of takes you by surprise. We watched so many playtests where the player would see it and say, "Whoa, that's weird." So we had Alex say the same thing a second later, almost like an echo.
Oh.
The Alex fans. You received my messages.
I did?
Come, enter.
Okay, thanks.
You are welcome.
So, what's
For
the
as long as we've been making choreographed scenes like this one, we found that there are two types of players.
Right, but I mean,
those who become engrossed with the characters, and those who tinker with everything around them. paying little attention to the scene's action. To make these environments entertaining for the tinkerers, we usually add objects for them to find and play with. Since this scene is split into 2 rooms, we were able to add a large number of interactions to this first room for players to discover after the Vortigaunt has moved to the second room. Some interactive objects are pure physically driven toys, like the dangling headcrab corpses and the hanging pans. Others are animations triggered by the player's actions, like the way the caged headcrabs react to the player approaching or shooting them. One type of object on the table is a squeezable headcrab heart, which is a remnant from an older version of this scene where the player would revive a wounded Vortigaunt by squeezing nectar from these hearts. While that scene didn't work out, we found the experience too compelling and, well, too gross to completely cut from the game.
In here. Come in. Come in. I must show you why I brought you. Enter.
The fundamental challenge of any choreographed dramatic scene like this one is making sure that we entertain the player without undermining the delivery of critical gameplay information. In this case, the player needed to leave this scene with the knowledge that the Vortigaunts have been imprisoned and that the player should seek the Northern Star. This particular scene went through many different variations during development, from a cooking scene with an extremely traumatized Vortigaunt to this humorous version. We even experimented with an interaction where the player was required to squeeze the nectar of several headcrab hearts into the Vortigaunt's mouth to revive him. While this was a memorable and novel VR interaction that ensured the player was engaged with the scene, the interactivity on the player's part often resulted in playtesters remembering the actions they took, but not the critical gameplay information. Eventually, we ended up with this more humorous scene, which struck an effective balance between entertainment and goal delivery. Importantly, we also distributed the scene across 2 separate rooms, breaking the information delivery into 2 steps. The first room where the player meets and learns about the state of the Vortigaunt, and the second room where the player is given their new goal. Separating these physically into rooms seemed to help players more reliably retain the critical information delivered in the second room. While this scene did undergo a lot of changes, one story beat remained virtually unchanged from the very first roughed-in version. The moment the Vortigaunt tosses a headcrab carcass down to the player and yells, "Sustenance!" Right from the start, this moment always got a great reaction from playtesters and remained all the way to the final product.
I will help the Alex fans. Look to the Northern Star.
Why?
For guidance.
Okay, thanks. Are you done helping?
I am not. Here. Sustenance.
I'll eat it later. Thanks for the help.
You will be welcome.
Alex, the signal's back. Can you hear me? Are you okay?
Russell, I'm good. How's Dad?
They've got him on the train. He's on the move. You've got to find Fairview Junction before they get there.
I'm working on it.
So anything happen when you cut out?
You're not gonna believe this, but...
We spend time on every game design element thinking about how the player is expected to learn of its existence and understand its details. Some design elements are so important that the game experience will break if the player doesn't understand them, while others may just be fun diversions or rewards for exploring the game's systems. Any required element will require work on our part to teach the player. In Half-Life, we try to teach elements in ways that feel as natural as possible, entwined within the core flow of the game so that you don't feel like the game just stopped to teach you something. We don't always succeed, but the attempts usually lead us somewhere interesting. In this case, we need to teach the players about the armored headcrab. The key elements that we want them to understand are that the headcrab is invulnerable on the top, but has a weak spot on its belly. We would also like the player to learn that the headcrab exposes its weak spot right before it jumps, but this isn't required. The player can fall back to shooting the weak spot as the headcrab scrambles around after a leap.
Teaching design elements of enemies is always tricky. Players have shown us for years that it's really hard to learn something new while under attack. We've also seen that invulnerability, in particular, is a difficult enemy feature to teach. If players are blasting away at an enemy, they are often not paying close attention to the impact feedback. If the enemy is vulnerable in some areas and not others, players may kill the enemy with a spray of gunfire, not realizing that some of their shots did nothing, while others hit critical weak spots. So when we approached the armored headcrab training, we knew we'd need to do significant work. The first step was to avoid placing the player under duress by containing the enemies inside this wire fence. Next, we placed headcrabs at eye level facing the player, exposing their bright, pulsing weak spot. If the player shoots one immediately, they are rewarded with a unique death effect where the headcrab explodes into chunks. This effect is designed to show the player that they did something special to kill this headcrab, as opposed to how they've been killing headcrabs up until now. There are a couple of other pieces in the setup here that are important. A second headcrab is placed right behind the lock the player must shoot to enter the cage, encouraging the player to notice the weak spot and try shooting it. 2 more headcrabs are loose in the cage, scripted to repeatedly attack invisible points on the wire fence. This ensures they are constantly demonstrating the way they expose their weak points before they leap, and this allows players to practice hitting the weak spot from behind the safety of the fence.
With any section of natural entwined training, we've observed that there's rarely any one thing that succeeds in teaching all players, nor do 100% of players leave with the perfect understanding we'd like. If player understanding is absolutely critical, we have to build a more bulletproof gate that ensures the player demonstrates understanding before moving onwards. In fact, we do just that when the player acquires the shotgun in the next area. In the case of the armoured headcrab, however, playtesting showed that we could afford to let a few players through with less than perfect understanding. This section gave them enough of a chance to experiment that they got a sense of what was going on, and further encounters with armoured headcrabs solidified it. There was still a lot of iteration on the visual design of the headcrab to further drive home its armour and weak point, and we also added a custom response to shotgun fire. In that case, the armoured headcrab flips over and wriggles for a second, exposing its weak point. This was added to reduce the resource loss we saw happening in players who were still struggling to understand the armoured headcrab mechanics after they acquired the shotgun.
Oh, that Vortigaunt I met? He did give me a headcrab to eat.
Oh, great! What did it taste like? Tell me how you...
Russell. I didn't eat it. Oh.
One challenge we always face when giving a new weapon or tool to the player is ensuring that they collect it before moving on. In these cases, we try to establish some kind of gate that the player can only get past using the new item. This can be especially tricky in cases where we are giving the player a new tool that doesn't fundamentally change their capabilities, as in the case of the shotgun, where almost everything that can be done with the shotgun can also be done with the pistol. In contrast, the pistol gate, where the player had to acquire the pistol before being able to shoot the lock off of the fence back at Russell's lab, was simple to design and execute. For this shotgun gate, we not only needed to ensure that the player collected the shotgun, but also that they learned how to load it before proceeding. We playtested a number of approaches to teaching the reload mechanics during combat, and repeatedly found that it didn't work. When faced with learning a new, complex task under duress, players would retreat back to using their pistol, which was a known quantity to them.
Once the player has collected the shotgun, they are only halfway through the shotgun gate. Next, they need to learn how to reload it. To drive home the necessity for the player to learn how to use this new weapon, we added an incoming threat, using a variety of audio and visual effects to sell it. While our goal is to make the player feel like they have a limited amount of time, the time pressure is entirely fake, and everything proceeds based on the player's progress in loading the shotgun for the first time. Once the shotgun has been loaded, a short timer starts, after which zombies burst through the walls. If the player happens to look at the walls before that timer is up, we abort the timer and introduce the zombies. The combination of a timer and a look trigger is a common trick used in places where we'd like the player to see a neat visual moment, but we can't wait forever or the game simply won't progress. The breaking of the walls by the zombies is the final step in opening the shotgun gate. Having new enemies open the way forward when they enter the player's space is a fairly tried and true method, but it's never one we're particularly happy with. It's always a bit too convenient and lacks agency on the player's part. But in a setup like this, which contains a novel puzzle, a new weapon, and its associated mechanics, plus an ambush, we're already dealing with a lot of design complexity packed into a small space, and further additions would complicate the scenario even further.
Hurry up and load that thing, it's getting louder.
4 shells left. We did it.
I love this gun.
The visual design of the shotgun included a number of challenges. Shotguns in games are generally powerful, and we communicate that power with bulk. As a result, they're big and held in 2 hands. But our experiments with two-handed VR weaponry didn't reach a level we were satisfied with. When holding a two-handed object in real life, the object itself provides a physical connection between the 2 hands, and that constraint allows players to stop thinking about it consciously, in addition to providing physical feedback. In VR, without that connection or feedback, we found that players had to keep maintaining their own internal sense of how they were holding their two-handed weapon, or they dripped their hands into positions that were hard for us to reconcile. As a result, our two-handed weapons required players to play along more than we liked. Since one of our core goals with Half-Life Alyx was to allow players to fully immerse themselves by ceasing to think about what they were doing in real life, we decided to focus on single-handed weapons, including the shotgun.
Our initial instinct with the shotgun design was to use a regular real-world shotgun, but modified, with a sawn-off stock and barrel so it would seem less cumbersome when held with one hand. This approach always resulted in the handle being at the rear of the weapon, and we ran into the problem where the weapon always felt front-heavy. But obviously, the VR controller in your hand wouldn't reflect that, leading to a disconnect between what you were feeling and what you were seeing. Placing the handle more centrally and underneath the weapon helped avoid this disconnect. This implied centre of mass wasn't really maintained well as the weapon accrued upgrades throughout the game, but the first impression was the most critical. Since we were going with an odd form, we were keen to use common shotgun visual elements wherever we could to help with player recognition and to ground the design in some reality. One element we borrowed was a common shotgun tube magazine that stores shells horizontally in line with the barrel, and we were just able to fit the gameplay requirement of 6 shells without the overall length becoming unwieldy. You can see the effort we had to go for further shell capacity in the design of our autoloader upgrade. Our first reloading mechanic was based on the realistic insertion of one shell at a time. Playtesters found this to be overly tedious, although we did receive some positive comments that it made them feel like an action movie star. The simple addition of allowing the players to insert 2 shells at a time solved this issue, allowing us to keep the good part of the design whilst losing the bad. We were keen to reinforce the whole action movie star thing, and experimented with some big gesture the player could do to finalise reloading. The inclusion of a pop-up mechanism allowed us to add an additional step to the reload that further separated it from our other weapons, yet had a satisfying flick of the wrist to complete the action.
As with the shotgun and the pistol, we needed a gate for the flashlight to ensure the player couldn't proceed without it. We tried a number of designs around the moment where the player collected the flashlight, but they all ended up being about the player picking up an object, and not specific to that object being a flashlight. Given that the flashlight's primary function is to provide light, we felt the gate needed to be an area of darkness. We also really wanted the player to be excited to get the flashlight, and that meant they had to experience darkness before collecting the flashlight. This turned out to be an interesting challenge, because we already had many poorly lit areas prior to this, and now we needed an area that was so dark that players would correctly interpret it as a gate. Our initial implementation was simply to ensure there were no lights within the hallway. Unfortunately, playtesting immediately showed that wasn't enough. Some VR headsets have extremely low black levels, and on those headsets, enough light bounced in from this lit area to enable players to move forward. In addition, our low ground fog provided just enough contrast in the dark hallway for players to make out the scene and stumble through it. Even once we removed fog and bounce light in this area, we saw yet other ways that players tried to move forward. Some players would fire their pistol repeatedly, using the muzzle flash as a strobing light source. Others would use the teleport targeting UI to probe the room, because at that point in the project, it had a small light source attached to it. In the end, we disabled muzzle flashes inside the hallway, and the teleport UI lost its light. The final step was the addition of some dialogue from Alex, commenting on the darkness and her need for a light source. This was aimed at solving a perceptual problem. Up until now, our game has taught players that their goal is to continue moving forward. And any time that forward progress is blocked, it's because there's something in the local area that needs solving. Given that structure, it's entirely rational for players to do everything they can to find some way to see in the darkness ahead. Alex's dialogue is aimed at telling the player that the game has recognized their attempts to move forward here, but the solution lies elsewhere. Subsequent playtesting showed us that this dialogue, coupled with the brightly lit area containing zombies off to the right, helped tug players past the darkness entrance and on towards the flashlight.
Last shot.
Like hacking and environmental puzzles, toner puzzles like this one are often used to relieve tension from combat and engage the player's mind in a refreshing way. This puzzle introduces a new junction type, which has 2 inputs and 2 outputs, as well as branching circuits. Functionally, it's just a simple airlock. Only one of the main combine gates can be powered on at a time, with an additional wrinkle that the smaller side gate on the return path must be powered down separately. In addition to providing a break between hectic combat encounters, this puzzle is a gameplay mechanic refresher since it's been some time since the player has seen a toner puzzle, and the next ones start to ramp up in complexity.
Dark.
Everything all right?
Nope, I'm good. I'm good. Oh, thank God.
In prior Half-Life games, the flashlight was attached to the player's body, which meant that it always illuminated the world from the same angle, relative to the player's point of view. With tracked hands in VR, we had the opportunity to let players manipulate the flashlight directly, and playtesters reacted very positively to this new freedom. In fact, our earliest implementation of a flashlight in Half-Life Alyx was an object that could be picked up in either hand or even set back down. This allowed the player to put the flashlight down somewhere, providing illumination for themselves while they accomplished another task. Unfortunately, this presented the possibility that a player could leave the flashlight behind, which would have been a game-breaking scenario. Implementing the flashlight as an object that players had to hold also prevented them from holding something else in that hand, which was tedious to manage and simply too punishing of a trade-off. In particular, it meant that weapon reloading was a nightmare, because the player no longer had a free offhand to perform the reload actions. In the end, we settled on a flashlight that attaches to the offhand and turns on and off automatically. This fixes the issues with reloading in the dark, potentially losing the flashlight, and has the nice side effect of not requiring the allocation of a button to toggle the light, which is especially helpful on controllers with fewer buttons. Since the automatic on-off behavior is controlled using level logic, designers could make performance and quality trade-offs in different areas of the game. After all, if a player could turn the flashlight on at any time, the rendering overhead of this shadow-casting light source would have to be accounted for throughout the entire game. On the other hand, if the flashlight is known to be off in a given area, a designer can make use of the resulting rendering headroom by increasing the fidelity of the environment in other ways.
This is fine. It's really dark. Russ?
Yeah?
Can you just talk?
About what?
About anything. Literally anything.
Well, I think that given our situation, your irrational fear of the dark is actually quite appropriate. You know, I can give you easily 100 reasons to be terrified.
Okay, that was my fault.
Shortly after adding the flashlight to the game, we discovered that playtesters would frequently brace their gun hand with their flashlight hand. This meant that the players had to orient their flashlight hand awkwardly to align the light with their aim. We decided to make this an automatic behavior of the offhand whenever it was brought close to the grip of the gun. If you do this, you'll see that the offhand grips the gun in a natural pose, and the flashlight aligns with the aim. In fact, if you look closely at the end of the flashlight, you'll notice that it has a ball joint. This allows the flashlight to articulate based on whether the offhand is gripping the gun or not. The ball joint has 4 different orientations, one for each gun, and a neutral orientation for when the player is not supporting the gun to aim. These 4 orientations ensure that the flashlight is always pointed in an ideal direction for the player. In one-handed mode, the flashlight attaches to the gun hand at an orientation that is ideal for all scenarios.
Big fan of this flashlight.
And it, not unlike yourself, is also sensitive to the dark.
Oh yeah?
Meaning it should go on automatically when the lights go out.
Oh, nice. All right, Russ. Really need you to talk again.
Absolutely. Be specific.
Before. What was life like before the Combine?
Ah, excellent. Alex, have you ever heard of a club sandwich?
Nope, not once.
Right. To make a club sandwich, you need to start with bread. Not from a bread line, from a bakery across the street. Baked that day, okay? You add tomatoes, lettuce, not vegetable paste, fresh. Then you add bacon. That's from an animal we used to call the pig. You toast the bread, and you put all that inside it.
You guys had all that? That's insane.
It is, and I'm not done. Then you add a second sandwich on top of the first one. You put ham in it, also from a pig, and turkey from an animal we used to call the turkey, and more tomato, more lettuce, and a bunch of other things I'm forgetting. It was 6 inches tall and weighed a pound and had a dozen ingredients from 5 different continents. It was the most impossible food item you could imagine in any age before ours.
Wow.
When the writers create a new character, we try to write a variety of material from that character's perspective to help find their voice.
You're welcome.
What motivates them? What do they sound like? How do they relate to other characters? It's helpful to know the answers to questions like this early in a project, particularly when working with a team, where different people might end up writing for that character. The club sandwich story that Russell tells in this section started out as one of these writing exercises. The writing team wrote pages and pages of Russell telling Alex stories about life before the Combine, getting irritated with her, telling bad jokes, pretty much the whole emotional spectrum. As we refined Russell's character, almost all of that fell by the wayside. We needed to do that work to get to Russell, but most of it didn't sound like Russell anymore. Later in the project, we decided to make Alex scared of the dark, so we needed Russell to talk a lot in this section to keep Alex company. It didn't matter what he was saying, it just had to be this voice in the darkness that she was grabbing onto. And then we remembered, hey, didn't we write a rambling sandwich monologue a year ago? And the club sandwich speech was resurrected.
space shells left.
Wait, is that a dead Combine soldier?
Yeah. When you guys were off sealing the reactor, I saw the Combine moving supplies in here. So, I guess they're interested in this place again.
Right, we'll keep an eye out. Something's definitely up.
Okay, so, right now, what it's like to live on Earth on a scale of 1 to 10. I'd say we're at a 2.
Yep, could always get worse.
What would you rate it before the Combine showed up?
Ooh, that's a toughie. I don't know. Good day? I'd say 6. Yeah, strong 6.
6? That's not great.
Now, that's life, Alex. You know, it's not always great.
Well, maybe we get the Combine off Earth and we could shoot for, like, an 8. You know?
Ooh, an 8. Yeah, that really would be nice. Really nice.
When building a Half-Life game, we try to start playtesting as soon as we can, even when we only have 10 or 15 minutes of gameplay built. We find it extremely helpful to see how players are reacting to what we've made as soon as possible. One of the major ways playtesting impacted Half-Life Alyx was in revealing how players reacted to the density of interactive elements in the world. Before we began, we were already aware that players would likely spend more time paying attention to the details of the world around them in VR, but we were unprepared for how significant this would be. Seeing some players spend 30 minutes messing around with a single interactive object really opened our eyes. As a result of those playtesting observations, we spent much of our development time focusing on the environment around the player and the level of details and interactivity to be found there. It might seem surprising that we didn't start with the assumption that we wouldn't need to spend that amount of time on the world, but the reality of game development is that we always have a finite amount of time to build a game and we're always making trade-offs. In the ideal case, we spend our finite time on whatever contributes the most to the player's experience. So, playtesting early and thereby getting a better sense of what elements are contributing to the player experience help us understand where to spend the limited time we have. In this case, those early playtests told us to significantly increase the amount we should budget for creating the world details and interactivity.
Oh, holy fish.
Barnacles are a unique enemy type in Half-Life Alyx in that they are static and often situated above the player's natural view direction. During testing in confined or dimly lit spaces, we often saw players walk into barnacle tongues without noticing them. One way we addressed this was with audio. In particular, we made idle barnacles emit subtle breathing, croaking, and grumbling sounds like the following. These sounds helped alert players to the presence of barnacles, and also made them seem like living creatures that were always active, not just a mechanical piece of gameplay that responded only to the player's actions. The head-related transfer functions available in Steam Audio were especially helpful, as they made it possible to accurately spatialize barnacle sounds so that the players could tell that the sounds were coming from above.
Early incarnations of manhacks were frustrating to fight in VR, since their audio was not providing enough information about their location. They seemed to appear from nowhere, and, even when close to the player, they lacked a dramatic presence. We tried a variety of layered sounds with varying distance fall-offs, but this often created more confusion, especially when multiple manhacks were nearby. Our ultimate solution to the problem consisted of two parts. The first was to make manhacks emit the following alarm-like warning sound when they first came into range or were deployed by a Combine soldier. The second part of our solution was to add more aggressive looping sounds with short fall-off distances. The short fall-off of these sound loops meant that this specific component of Manhack's sound treatment would only be audible quite near the player. Thus, when players heard these sounds, they knew that Manhacks had begun hunting them, and one or more was getting close enough to be of concern.
Oh, Manhack!
Before Final Out was added, the cramped dark area of this level did not take players very long to traverse. But as the fidelity of the game increased, players spent more and more time getting to this point. As we've learned over the years, too much time in dark underground areas can become fatiguing to players, and this is even more significant in VR. This outdoor section provides a change of pace and a brief respite from the dark. Not only does it give players something visually different and interesting to look at, it allows them to clearly see and assess threat in an open space, allowing them to get some easy kills with a little stress. It was also important to provide some variety here, as players are about to head into a dark area that requires precision shooting and flashlight usage.
So, when we get the Combine off of Earth, what are you gonna do?
I'm going full production mode on the Russells, of course.
Oh, of course. You'll be sitting on a landmine.
Gold mine, yep. So here's the plan. Conservative estimate, I figure 1 year to get the world unconquered by the Combine, get them off the planet. So that's year
This section, with a multitude of explosive barrels embedded in Zen overgrowth, was designed to switch up player expectations and change the pacing of the level. Prior to this point in the game, explosive barrels and canisters were used as offensive weapons. In this space, they're deadly to the player. If a barrel or canister does explode, it sets off a fatal chain reaction. This change in priority forces players to aim carefully and adds intensity without combat. This has the positive side effect of training players to utilize the pistol even more effectively. While the automatic alignment of the flashlight with a braced weapon is useful in direct combat, in this section we observed players taking advantage of the decoupled weapon and flashlight as they illuminated and targeted barnacles in the intricate Zen foliage overhead.
Oh boy. Getting dark again.
We decided early on that the environments we wanted to portray in Half-Life Alyx would benefit from an investment in high-quality volumetric lighting. This component of illumination is an indispensable tool, not just for creating atmosphere, but for drawing the player's attention to critical gameplay elements. Our system works in 3 phases. In the first phase, illumination from static light sources is captured in a 3-level hierarchical volumetric clip map surrounding the player. The highest resolution level of this clip map measures 1 cubic inch per voxel. The clip map is updated incrementally, less than once per frame, as the player moves throughout the scene. In the second phase, a compute shader ray marches in view space throughout the clip maps, accumulating static lighting, dynamic lighting, and volumetric extinction. The ray marching is performed every frame and employs temporal anti-aliasing to improve quality. In the final phase, we resample lighting and volumetric scattering from the prior phase for each eye once per frame. The result is a texture that describes, for any given view space depth, volumetric scattering and extinction, which we apply during forward rendering.
These guys are automatic weapons.
We always introduce new enemies at a distance, and never while the player is under duress. Here, the player is able to observe the Combine soldiers killing some wandering zombies, giving the player an idea of how powerful the soldiers are, and how they might operate in combat. We located the Combine far enough away that it was plausible that they would not notice the player, but close enough that the player could choose to engage, but remain relatively safe from return fire.
Oh, that really worked, didn't it? Huh. Wow, my gun's looking pretty good.
Russ, come on. At this point, it's kind of power gun.
Oh wow, check it out. My gun just keeps getting better and better.
You know, Russ, technically, I don't think there's a whole lot of your gun left in it.
I'll tell you what, let's put that idea on hold for now. We can chat about my gun. You get back.
Well, Russ, it's official. There is nothing left of your gun in this gun. It's just... This is my gun.
Alright, fair enough. You earned it. I still want those Russells back, though. Oh, that should come in handy. Combine do know how to upgrade a gun, I'll give them that.
Three shells left.
Looking very deadly. That is about as deadly as that thing's gonna get.
The first encounter with a Combine soldier caused a number of issues in playtesting. The biggest one was that players were often surprised when the soldiers started shooting at them. Some players who were new to the Half-Life series had no idea who these soldiers were. But it's also been hours of game time since players saw another human, and we found that many players weren't willing to immediately start shooting. Some players also wondered why Alex moved so quickly to killing other humans. This area was designed to demonstrate that Combine soldiers are hostile and will attack on sight, giving the player a reason to want to shoot back. It starts with the dialogue preceding the encounter, where the player overhears the Combine discussing the problem of scavengers in the quarantine zone. Then, when the player finally achieves visual contact with their first Combine soldier, they witness that soldier in the process of executing a civilian scavenger.
squad soldier AI has been a mainstay of the Half-Life series, so we were excited to see how their design would be impacted by the move to VR. Our early playtesting against a Half-Life 2 Combine soldier AI in VR immediately made a number of things clear. First, players did not like to be shot at, and often had a visceral negative response. The soldiers frequently ran at players at full speed, firing all the while, and we discovered that the speed of Half-Life 2 combat was simply too overwhelming in VR. Also, players took longer to do everything in VR, especially the core action of spotting and aiming their weapon at an enemy while staying in cover. As a result, the soldiers tended to live much longer in VR than they did in Half-Life 2. It was clear from these early playtests that the most common reaction among players was to immediately seek cover from enemy fire. So we started experimenting with changes to the soldier AI, aimed at building a combat experience around players' tendency to seek cover. Early experiments were focused on keeping Combine soldiers at a comfortable distance from the player, while keeping them moving around enough to not have combat become too static. To create lulls in firing for players to peek out from cover, we prevented soldiers from shooting while on the run in most cases. To keep players from remaining stationary, we created a concept of flushing, where squads will attempt to flush the player out of cover, and we gave each class of soldier a different method of flushing out the player. But even in these early tests, it was also clear that players weren't capable of fighting soldiers until they'd gotten skilled in a number of basic combat actions, like reloading their gun without having to focus all their attention on it. So we were careful to slowly introduce the various types of soldiers, and even individual features within the soldier classes. For example, these early fights against Combine soldiers only feature the basic grunts, and these particular grunts don't carry grenades. This means they don't actually have the capability to flush a player out of cover. We found it was important in these first fights to give players all the time they need to learn to use cover effectively, before we start introducing enemies that could try and flush them out.
There's a control station override nearby. Have plenty of time to get the override back online. Alright, I'll be able to stop the train right here.
You sure you can do that?
Absolutely. You just need to activate the terminal.
Nice.
Then, right, that's the terminal there.
I'm on it.
Do hurry though. There must be a battery around here somewhere. Maybe it's missing a piece. Okay, no worries. But the train is coming. Just get me in. It'll only take a second. You're doing great.
Yep. No worries.
Okay, now just re-engage the system.
Is it supposed to come off?
That's the opposite of what it's supposed to do, Alex.
What do I do now?
Oh, well, don't panic. Well, stop panicking if you are.
I'm not panicking.
Yes, but I am. We need to find another way to stop this train. 10 seconds, Alex. Okay, just throw the switch there. 5 seconds.
It won't stay.
You've got to hold it down.
combat moment to reward players for fighting their way through the dark, scary tunnels. Not only that, but the pace of the story was leading up to its most important moment thus far, the rescue of Eli Vance. Crashing the Combine prison train that was transporting Eli felt like the exact right thing to accomplish these goals, and it gave us the opportunity to create some VR spectacle.
Let's go find Dad.
We wanted to achieve the cinematic chaos of causing a train wreck, while giving the players an active role in the event. Our first attempts to design the scenario were a challenge. It turned out that directing the players' attention wasn't as simple as ensuring they were in the right position through gameplay. In our initial tests, players frequently failed to see some or all of the spectacular train wreck. The crash was one of the first destruction sequences we put into the game, so we had a lot to learn about player behavior in VR and how to direct the player naturally to immerse them in the chaos. On top of that, to continually hit our target frame rate, we needed to create a cascading series of events, so that only some of the destruction was happening at any given time. Sound design, level design, effects, and animation had to be carefully coordinated to lead the player's attention through each stage of the wreck. For example, at the start of the crash, we used the sounds of train cars piling up in the distance, encouraging players to look in that direction before one of the train cars lifts up and blasts through the concrete connector. At the end of the sequence, the Smokestack Collapse is used to direct the player's attention to their eventual path forward, and we wanted players to witness its destruction. Before bringing down the smokestack, we gave players a brief moment of rest, and, again, used sound to draw their attention to the smokestack. Initially, we used a rumbling sound preceding its collapse, but we found this to be too subtle in practice, and instead added the transient explosion sound, which drew the player's attention towards the smokestack more reliably.
Dad!
I'm over here, honey.
Okay, I'm gonna reach out and pull you up. It's gonna be okay.
For the rescue of Eli, we wanted to create a tense, just out of reach moment where the player physically saves him. But for the rest of the story to work, Alex and Eli had to take different paths at the end of the scene. We tried a few different approaches, including a version where Eli was hanging from a ledge just in front of the player, and the player could reach down to attempt to grab Eli's hand to pull him up. In practice, however, players' hands would collide with the real-world floor. Not only did this make it impossible to reach Eli, it took players out of the moment, wrecking the emotion of the scene. Since Eli and Alex had to take different paths, we tried an approach where Alex rescued Eli, but he was injured and couldn't proceed. Unfortunately, many players would stick around, not wanting to abandon him. Eventually, we arrived at the solution that shipped in the final product. Separating Eli from the player with the Vortigaunt's rescue made for a much more meaningful return and fulfillment of the Vortigaunt's promise to help Alex. The datapod that Eli found was an addition that not only let us integrate Eli back into the story later, but also gave him something to do, so there was a much stronger reason why he would not accompany the player on their journey going forward.
The QZ, and it's big. Get above ground and see what you can find. I will accompany the Eli back and ensure his safety.
Great. Thank you. Dad, I'm gonna go find this vault.
Go. Stay safe, baby. I love you.
I love you too. Thank you. Hey, Russ. Keep an eye out for Dad, okay?
I'll let you know if he gets here. When he gets here.